Welcome to my channel, where the scariest stories come to life. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into the horror. Back when I was a trainee park ranger up here in Washington, I used to patrol this one trail that was popular with nearby college students. The campus was maybe only a 30 or 40-minute walk away from this particular trail, which was fairly short and sat on the northeastern edge of the park. So some weekends, the trail would be dotted with groups of students partaking in a little wholesome outdoor exercise. Occasionally, you'd get a group doing something not so wholesome, either drinking or just making a general nuisance of themselves. But for the most part, the hikers among them tended to be polite and well-behaved, although they didn't exactly run like clockwork. There was one particular time when the trail would almost always be completely deserted due to even the most studious college kids' propensity for drinking. Saturday mornings were, without a doubt, the quietest time of the week. On the rare occasion you did see anyone, it was usually someone a little older, sometimes a couple, but never anyone college-aged. So this one very early morning, when I suddenly spotted someone ahead of me on the trail that looked a lot like a college kid, it definitely raised an eyebrow. You might be wondering how someone looks like a college kid. Well, first-time hikers tend to look underprepared in both their equipment and their clothing, and this girl had no pack and wore something that looked better suited to a Friday night party than a Saturday morning's hike. She was also walking at a particularly slow pace, the kind of pace that says, "I thought this was a good idea, but now I want to go home," which is very typical of first-time college-age hikers who bite off a little more than they can chew. She was walking so slowly that I started wondering if she was still drunk from the night before or something. Every so often, she'd stumble or sway slightly, and this made me increasingly concerned. As I caught up with her, I also happened to notice that her clothes looked pretty dirty, almost like she'd either fallen or had taken a dirt nap of some kind. It also looked like she was sweating a phenomenal amount. Her hair was wet and stringy, and there was a big dark patch around her back and shoulders where the fabric was clinging to her wet skin. She was obviously in a really bad way. I just had no idea how bad her condition actually was. When it got to the point where I was only about 10 to 15 feet behind her, she still hadn't turned around to notice me, and I knew just silently passing her might scare her half to death. So I figured I'd just wish her a good morning to announce my presence. But as soon as I did that, the girl turned around, and I just about jumped back in horror at what I saw. The girl had a horrific head wound above her eye, and the eye itself was so completely caked with blood that I'm not sure she could see out of it. Someone had seriously tried to cave this girl's head in, and the fact that she was still walking around seemed like nothing short of a miracle. As soon as she laid her one good eye on me, she just sort of collapsed down onto her butt, reaching up to me and croaking, "Water, water," over and over again. I rushed to give her some water, then radioed into HQ to get her some medical attention, but as I did so, a certain smell hit my nostrils. It was as intense as it was recognizable, and it suddenly hit me that whatever she'd been through was no accident. She wasn't soaked with sweat. Someone had poured gasoline on her. I kept asking her what had happened, but she couldn't seem to get any words out. She just kept drinking more and more water, then staring off into the distance like she was on the verge of going into shock. The only thing she said to me before passing out was, "My friends," which scared me, thinking that there were more kids hurt or in danger somewhere out there on the trail. I kept thinking that she was going to die right there on the trail with me, but she still had a pulse when a coworker with an ATV stretcher trailer showed up, and as far as I knew, she was still alive when the EMTs rushed her to the hospital. Myself and the rest of the ranger team then spent the rest of the morning combing through the woods around the northeastern trail, looking for any signs of the poor girl's friends. All we found was a doused campfire with a few empty beer and liquor containers surrounding it, but the ranger who found it was quick to add that the place reeked of gasoline. We didn't get the full story until a week or so later, and knowing what actually happened to the girl made her only words to me, "My friends," seem all the more haunting. She wasn't saying it because she was worried about them. It was more a case of her asking why people she believed were her friends would do something so awful to her. Yep, there had been no ambush of some innocent college kids by a masked horror movie psycho. This girl's own friends had lured her out into the woods, beat her half to death, and tried to set her on fire. I found out later that the only thing that stopped them from actually lighting her on fire was that someone's lighter wasn't working. The group then tried to light a stick on fire using their campfire, but it was a slow process, and by the time they'd made themselves a torch, their victim had managed to run off into the woods and hide. She stayed put for a few hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, and finally got enough adrenaline going to try to make her way out of the woods. And that's when I found her. And knowing she'd get the help she needed, her body just shut down again. They attacked her over some stupid love triangle, too, the ringleader having a crush on a guy who had a crush on the victim in turn. Jealousy boiled over, and I guess the alcohol fueled the violence. But a group of college kids legitimately conspired to burn one of their peers alive, all because of a teenage crush. That's the scariest thing in the world to me, and so utterly terrifying because I just can't understand it. The guilty parties all got arrested and kicked out of college. Most were handed lengthy prison sentences after a pretty well-publicized trial. My ranger team was glued to the radio during news breaks for 2 weeks, desperate for any updates, and that's how we came to know the horrifying extent of what had occurred that night. The encounter that morning, and the eventual discovery of what happened to that poor girl, made for one of the more frightening and disturbing moments of my career. There are some real scary places out there in the woods. There's a kind of innocence to grizzlies and mountain lions. They'll kill you to survive. People, on the other hand, people kill just to watch each other die. For the past 4 years or so, I've worked as a full-time park ranger for the British National Trust, established almost 130 years ago. The National Trust is the largest heritage conservation society in the United Kingdom, and its job is to look after places of historic significance or natural beauty across the country. This includes everything from old stately homes to national parks. Since I grew up in County Down, here in Northern Ireland, my career as a park ranger inevitably saw me posted to the Mourne Mountains. The mountains encompass a few different forests and parks that come under the jurisdiction of the National Trust: Silent Valley, Tullamore, and Rosterver, to name a few. But since they're all in an area that's only about 15 miles across, they're all under the remit of the team I'm a member of. I said I'd been a ranger for 4 years, but I did my training around Mourne too, and since I was raised just north in Legan, I knew the area like the back of my hand. By the time it came to my ranger promotion, my experience meant that team members would often come to me if they needed any expert advice on local terrain and navigation. This is how I ended up getting a phone call early one morning from a colleague in need of assistance. She'd had a call from someone she described as a very upset camper, who'd woken up at dawn to find a couple of dead sheep outside his tent. That's the phrase my colleague used, a couple, and since sheep have a nasty habit of turning up dead for a multitude of reasons, I didn't think too much of it. As I might have touched on, the reason my colleague had asked for my help was that I'd have a much better chance than her of actually finding where the guy was camped. And as much as I was willing to lend a hand, I was curious as to why the camper couldn't just lead my colleague back to his camp. My colleague replied something to the effect of *, it's not that he can't go back, it's that he won't go back. Honestly, he seems terrified. This really piqued my interest, because although a few dead sheep definitely aren't the most pleasant thing to wake up to, I couldn't see how someone would be terrified of it. Then add the fact that they were too scared to even go back to their campsite to collect their belongings. As I said, it piqued my interest. From the fairly vague description I was given by my colleague, I was able to roughly pinpoint the area where the guy's camp had been. If he'd been pitched at a marked campsite, it would have been much easier to find and a much more public affair. But since he was wild camping, or rambling as some folks say, he basically pitched his tent in the middle of nowhere with very little to go on in terms of location, aside from near such and such field. While out searching, I got my colleague on the phone again, who still had the terrified camper with her down at our Mourne Country Park office, and basically asked her to rinse the guy for information. According to him, after coming across the horrifying scene, he'd basically run all the way from his campsite to Mourne Country Park. He hadn't run the whole way, though. He slowed his pace when he felt he'd put himself at a safe distance. And because it was so early in the morning, he'd had to walk past a few other homes and businesses before he saw anything that could help him. I asked why he hadn't just called someone from his campsite, but the camper repeated that he'd been terrified and hadn't bothered to grab anything before fleeing the area. At this point, as I'm driving around on speakerphone, I start wondering just how many dead sheep it takes to scare someone who was apparently well into middle age. This wasn't some scared kid my colleague had with her. He was older than me by the sounds of things, so I told my colleague to ask him exactly how many dead sheep had been outside his tent. The reply came back, *I don't know. The guy couldn't even guess. He only added, it was a mess up there, and that I should take a gun of some kind with me if I'm the one investigating. I only overheard that last part. My colleague didn't entertain the idea by repeating it to me. I don't know what it's like for park rangers over in America, but 99% of national park staff here remain completely unarmed at all times and have absolutely no access to firearms of any kind. We just don't really need it. We don't have any kind of crazy wildlife that necessitates that kind of kit, so some guy saying that I need to take a gun with me just sounded like complete and utter hysteria. I ended up talking to him personally, and I got him to describe his campsite as best he could, in painstaking detail if possible. He tried his best, but nothing seemed to click until he mentioned how on his first day's walk, he passed a large body of water that looked to be in a kind of C shape. The only large lake or reservoir in the Mournes shaped like that is the Spelga Dam, and with the camper saying that he pitched his tent only 5 or 10 minutes walk from the very obvious source of fresh water, that narrowed down my search area by quite a bit. Then, after playing a little mental game of where would I camp near Spelga, I decided to drive over to check out 2 distinct places with great cover and concealment. The first one was no good, but the second one was a bingo. I see a bright red tent sitting among some trees up ahead of me. The guy had chosen to camp among some trees, meaning I couldn't see much from a distance, dead sheep included. But after trudging across a muddy field and hopping a fence, I finally got a good look at what had scared the camper so much. And let me tell you, it put the fear of God into me too. From what I could gather, the reason why the man had been unable to give us an exact number of dead sheep is that there were bits and pieces of wool, flesh, and bone strewn all over his campsite. It was mind-bogglingly upsetting to look at. I had never seen anything like it in all my life, let alone during the course of my ranger career. I had to count the sheep skulls, or what I could at least guess were the remains of their skulls, to get an accurate number, and I counted 4 eviscerated sheep around that man's campsite. 4. There was little wonder he'd been so terrified, having a sight like that be the first thing greeting him in the morning. I considered myself quite hardy when it comes to things like that, but sweet baby Jesus, even I found myself shaken having come across that scene. As soon as I was able, I contacted another colleague of mine, told them exactly where the campsite was, and asked them to lock the place down so we could secure the scene. I know it seems a bit over the top, going all CSI over a few sheep, but if something like that happens, we have to ensure there's some degree of evidence preservation so we can at least get an idea of what happened. Then, while they got on with that, I intended to drive over to Mourne Country House to have a chat with our frightened camper. I had a number of questions for him, things I wanted to hear with my own ears and not via my colleague over the phone. When I arrived, the guy was still quite shaken up, sitting in the little porta cabin in the car park that serves as the National Trust office for Mourne Country House. My colleague Jane had already given him about 3 or 4 cups of tea and was only happy to make me one too. Before I got to asking my questions, they were irrelevant, really. I was confident we'd find out everything we needed to know from the scene, but I was very curious as to how the guy didn't wake up during the night. Obviously, he didn't have much of an answer for me. I asked him if he was a heavy sleeper, And he said he didn't think so, then added that he believed someone had dumped the sheep's remains there as a kind of warning. I asked him if he'd angered or annoyed anyone during his trip, but again, he said he didn't think so. It was definitely curious, but the guy was being a very little help, so I thought I'd just crack on with the next task at hand, which was trying to find out which farmer had 4 sheep missing. It was still very much a possibility that the 4 sheep had managed to break out of a pen somewhere, went on the run, and then got attacked by a dog or a pair of foxes. Stranger things than that have happened around Morn, I can assure you, but few things as strange as what I was dealing with that day. We quickly found the farm from which all 4 missing sheep had come, so I drove over to have a word with the farmer and to check on his fences. This is where the story starts to get really weird. We were already at weird with the dead sheep right next to the camp, but this next part catapulted the situation way past a head-scratcher and into territory that was downright unsettling to me. The farmer in question told me that 4 sheep had indeed gone missing from his farm, only they'd done so over the past 2 weeks, one going missing every couple of nights. What's more, the farmer was only too happy for me to inspect his fences for him because he'd been up the wall with them for weeks, and he couldn't work out where the sheep were getting out. I could hardly claim to be an expert in livestock farming, but I had my suspicions. I inspected the entire perimeter of his field, and there were 0 gaps or breaches for the sheep to escape through. Then while standing there, I remembered how my colleague had mentioned that there'd been more than a couple of sheep turned up dead on the other side of Morn in the same time frame, so I figured I'd check in with a few farmers there and see if they'd lost any sheep too. I did that, and they hadn't just lost sheep either. While I was out on my own, I'd learned of 5 separate farms that had reported a similar incident: sheep going missing, sheep turning up dead. At one farm, one of the farmers had even gone so far as to stake out his field. Apparently, on the night he'd done that, he saw a few dogs come sniffing around. When he went out to scare them off, they'd been gone before he even got close enough to see them. But I knew his theory had a lot more credibility than mine because he was a farmer and had dealt with the problem before, while I was just a ranger who had never encountered anything like it. By the end of the day, it began to feel like the dead sheep were the least of my worries. I'll never forget how, on my drive back to Morn Country House, I caught sight of 2 large dogs standing out in the middle of the field, between 2 of the farms I'd visited. They didn't seem to be doing anything in particular, just staring straight at me, and they were so massive that I could barely believe my eyes. I took a couple of pictures of them before they took off, blending into the dark, forested area. I figured they'd probably gone off after some poor farmer's sheep, just like the others had before them. Not long after that, I heard from one of the farmers I'd been to visit earlier in the day that there was some crazy dog acting aggressively toward his sheep in the area. I couldn't say whether it was the same one I'd seen or just one of the other packs that had been running wild, but it was becoming clear that it was a far bigger problem than I'd anticipated. After spending the day running around checking farms and talking to people, I returned to the Morn Country Park office to check in with my colleague about the state of the crime scene. Thankfully, nothing else had gone awry with the camper or the dead sheep, so I headed back to my own house at the end of a long day. I woke up the next morning to what sounded like a herd of sheep outside my window. I rushed to the window and saw nothing but grass, so I thought I'd just imagined it. I'm a bit of an anxious person, so I shrugged it off. That night, I woke up in the dead of night to the same sounds, but this time they were amplified, as if they were right outside my bedroom. I could feel my heart rate start to spike, and I quickly picked up my phone to check the time, thinking it might be something to do with the sheep at the farm. It was just after 2 in the morning. When I went to the window, I finally managed to spot the source of the commotion. Sure enough, there were 3 massive dogs, pacing right in front of my window. I say pacing, but they were more like patrolling, moving in synchronized motion while standing at attention. They were a good distance away from my window, so I could only see their vague shapes. But I could also see the way they moved. There was no sign of the sheep, but I could see that they were all staring in my direction. I think it's a testament to how deeply unsettling I found it that, even being in the safety of my own home, I still felt my heart racing, and it didn't stop there. I stayed glued to the window for a good while longer, just watching these creatures. It felt as though they were waiting for something that would happen at any moment. The longest few minutes passed. Eventually, they seemed to lose interest in my house altogether. They slowly turned away from my direction and vanished into the darkness of the field. But I didn't sleep at all that night. I just kept staring at my window, half expecting those huge silhouettes to come right back at any moment. The next day, I woke up with one thing on my mind: I had to find out more about those dogs. I figured I'd just head into town and ask around. It was a very small town, and I'd been living in the area long enough to know some of the locals and what they might have seen or heard. And I got lucky, because the first person I spoke to was a farmer who didn't live too far from where I saw the dogs. He told me he'd seen them before, too. Apparently, they'd been roaming the hills for months now, and no one seemed to know who they belonged to or where they came from. The fact that they had shown up so suddenly after the spate of sheep going missing was interesting enough, but it became a very big deal when I discovered that someone else had seen them stalking the same areas I had, too. By now, it was nearly impossible to ignore the grim reality: the dead sheep and the dogs were connected. They had to be. But how? After what felt like an eternity of stressing about it, I finally put two and two together. I called my colleague, Jane, at Morn Country Park and told her everything I'd learned. She wasn't very happy to hear it, but at least it got me back on the job, investigating again. We ended up visiting several farms to put our heads together, share knowledge, and see if any of the local farmers had a similar story to tell. It was something of a miracle that we even managed to get some additional information. We discovered there was a local shepherd who'd been using dogs to work his sheep for years now, but he hadn't seen any of his own dogs for about a month. This was huge news for us because we had a theory that these dogs were deliberately attacking the sheep and had grown more feral over the past few weeks. Of course, the fear of them being lost was still there. But if we could find this shepherd, he could help us understand what might have happened to them and what had become of the sheep. So we set out on our search again, and I even enlisted a few of the local farmers to help track the shepherd down. We drove around for most of the day, making sure to cover every field and forest until we finally found a few locals who pointed us toward a derelict building deep in the woods. When we got there, we heard that familiar noise again, and it sent chills up my spine. The dogs had returned. We found them gathered in a circle around something, and as we got closer, I could see they had brought down one of the local sheep. It was absolutely horrifying. I felt like I was on the set of a horror movie at that point, but the feeling of dread was almost overwhelming. Jane had come along with me, but we couldn't get close enough to make sense of what was happening. We stayed hidden for a while, trying to see what the dogs would do. They were more aggressive than ever. I realized they were wild dogs, having adapted to life in the hills of Morn after years of not being used for what they were bred for. I had no idea how long they had been stalking and hunting together, but I began to wonder how much longer it would be before they started targeting humans. The thought sent a chill down my spine. And when Jane suggested calling the police, I had to stop her. I didn't want to risk losing the opportunity to see these creatures in action. I was almost certain that the wild dogs were responsible for the missing sheep, and I wanted to get proof. So we stayed put. At that point, the sun began to set. A gust of wind rattled the trees, and suddenly, all three dogs snapped their heads up. They seemed to hear something, and in one swift moment, they broke formation and took off toward the tree line, disappearing into the shadows. After they vanished, we waited for a few more minutes, and when it became clear that they were not coming back, I whispered to Jane that we should try to find that shepherd. We headed back to the derelict building, which turned out to be a disused barn. I had a sinking feeling that the dogs might have been drawn to it for some reason, so we crept inside. Once we were in, we found something that made my stomach churn: a pile of bones, remains of other sheep and animals. There were so many that we had to assume the dogs had been hunting them for quite some time, but that was not what shocked me. I knew exactly what had happened to them. We didn't spend long in that barn before we realized we were running out of time. It was getting dark, and those dogs would likely be back soon. We decided it was better to make a run for it before they returned. Once we left the barn, we decided to head straight to the farm. After checking in with a few locals about the whereabouts of the shepherd, we finally tracked him down. But when we got there, we were both horrified by what we found. He'd been attacked by his own dogs. What the hell was going on? We arrived at his house, and it was clear he had tried to defend himself. The door was broken down, and the place was a mess. It wasn't until we got inside that I saw the blood and shredded clothing on the floor. I froze. He had fought them off, but it was too late. It looked like he'd just barely made it out alive. Just as we turned to head back outside, a terrible growl echoed from the back of the house. Jane and I both froze again, suddenly remembering where we were. We were alone in the woods, and the dogs were out there waiting for us. We barely made it to our car before the growls grew closer, echoing around us. I slammed the car door shut, and we sped off as fast as we could, hearts racing and minds racing even more. After that night, the reports kept rolling in. More sheep were killed, more dogs appeared out of nowhere. I can't explain what happened after that, but I will say that I never returned to that part of Morn again. It took me a long time to come to terms with what I had seen, but eventually, I had to face it all and accept that I had uncovered something I shouldn't have. I don't know what those dogs were doing, but I think they're still out there in those woods, still hunting. And they probably got a few more secrets they don't want to share. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give the video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. See you in the next one.